destroying bridges and power stations are customary, legal, and necessary in our fight with this crazy theocracy in Iran. Don't believe the false analysts. Prevailing in Iran means that the decent majority of that society can rebuild and again join the community of nations.
And now, The Edwin Black Show. Sponsored by the books of Edwin Black, available on Amazon and at booksellers worldwide. And now, here's Edwin.
Hello, this is Edwin Black, investigative journalist, historian, and human rights author of 325 editions in 40 languages in 190 countries worldwide, including IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and my latest, Israel Strikes Iran. Ours is a show for opinion makers and decision makers, not mass clicks. So subscribe for alerts at theedwinblackshow.com. And if you want to support our work, we certainly need your assistance. Please visit theedwinblackshow.com/support. Your help, big or small, assures our complete and utter intellectual and uncensored journalistic independence. Go to theedwinblackshow.com/support and keep us independent. Today's episode is made possible and sponsored without any preconditions, requests, or stipulations by members of the medical community of the Miami area and my scoop book, Israel Strikes Iran, available everywhere across the planet in 12 paperback, hardback, electronic, and audiobook editions. The Edwin Black Show, along with our YouTube site, speaks frankly and without tremor to a fragmented world seeking better understanding of our tormented past, our present, very, very tense, and a turbulent future, still uncertain. By the way, stay tuned for my special word of wisdom at the very end of the show, just before I sign off. We'll get to our main topic on the legality of the Iran war in just a few moments. But first, these items. Item 1, the March of the Living just concluded at Auschwitz, bringing together 50 survivors and thousands of marchers. As scholar in residence for the march, I was amazed at the tone expressed by so many. The mourning has given way to warning, as everywhere people speak about safety and discomfort in their previously secure democratic countries such as Australia and Canada. And they all spoke of an exit strategy. We know so many have already exited to Israel. We were reminded that from the smoke of Auschwitz arose a mighty renewed nation, the State of Israel, which every hour continues to fight for its existence. The skeletons became survivors, and the survivors became soldiers, and the soldiers gave rise to a new society. Yes, men, women, and children no longer came with nothing, and they achieved everything. They ripped the yellow stars off their chests and pasted them onto their shoulders, painted those stars blue, added stripes above and below, and behold, from the forests and the ghettos and the opened camp gates came a fighting nation. Never again would they jump into the pit naked, but rather they would race into the tunnels fully armored and soar into the skies in fierce flying machines, ready to defend their right to exist, no longer asking permission to live, and determined to commune. Passover reminded us, Vahi Sha'amda, in every generation they arise against us to destroy us, and the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, our friends are temporary, and our adversaries are permanent. I give you the Bible. Numbers 23:9, quote, from the top of the rocks I see them, a people that dwells alone, not reckoned among the nations, close quote. At the final ceremony of the recent March of the Living at Auschwitz, I was quite moved when IDF Chief Cantor, Lieutenant Colonel Shai Abramson, sang the song of the fighting partisans who waged war from the forests. And he sang it in Yiddish.
Als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Gott Himmeln bleiene, verstellen blojete,
just like my father and mother sang it when they were fighting partisans in the Polish woods. And they told me that every day they prayed to God to deliver them just one more day. As the cantor's voice pierced the air, I also recalled the brave men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, praying to the heavens as they did. Then the speakers on stage also reminded us and the world that every day the brave men and women of the IDF also pray to God as they fight to preserve life and the nation. We are reminded of the Talmudic injunction for self-defense and warfare to save lives. It is the principle of self-defense and the mandate to preserve life, the principle of Pikuach Nefesh, which overrules all other religious tenets in Judaism. Save life. And then my mind went to Pope Leo XIV, who on Palm Sunday a few weeks ago declared that God, quote, does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects them, close quote. Pope Leo says this about the men who stormed Normandy, about every Jew in the IDF, and my parents who fought as partisans. At the same time, he condemns Trump's war to save humanity from nuclear conflagration by religious fanatics in Iran. Pope Leo, who in the heck are you to tell us what prayers God hears? I know the world sees you as a great holy man, but I see you as just another product of the Catholic Church in Chicago, one of the most criminal and corrupt organizations in American history. I'm from Chicago, so you, Pope Leo, know what I know about Chicago. I spent some of my early years investigating the Catholic Church in Chicago, as did a cadre of Catholic reformers and Catholic journalists. Fact, the Catholic Church in Chicago completely partnered with the corrupt Democratic political machine and the Chicago mob's worst gangsters to make millions and accrue power. Let's go back a few decades. The church back then was led by Cardinal John P. Cody. He lived in a mansion and he had a mistress, effectively a wife, Helen Dolan Wilson, who he showered with a missing $1 million of church money that funded a Boca Raton vacation home and many other benefits. The Chicago Sun-Times was among the leaders in exposing this. A federal grand jury was close to indicting Cardinal Cody for embezzlement when he died. The Chicago Archdiocese was loaded with child predator priests. Scores of priests afflicted young boys and girls, and when they were exposed, the Archdiocese transferred them to out-of-the-way parishes such as in Arizona, where they would repeat offend. Last Thanksgiving, 2025, the Chicago Diocese was hit with the so-called Predator Pipeline lawsuit, accusing the church of reassigning pervert priests to enable them to reoffend against new child victims. Lawyers said, quote, this wasn't just a series of bad decisions, it was a system. For decades, the Archdiocese relied on secrecy and reassignment, putting children in harm's way, close quote. The church was partners with the daily political machine, participating in their power and control schemes. Somehow, everywhere there was a Chicago public school, a few hundred feet away, there was a church parish property, generally a stately rector's home. In 2021, the Archdiocese listed $1 billion in cash and assets, including millions in banks. Yet the church serviced so many impoverished communities, especially on the South Side. But since the Al Capone days, the Catholic Church has partnered with the mob. America's most famous gangster was regularly giving communion at a South Side church, St. Columbanus, now known as St. Moses the Black, down on 71st Street near the highway. Church archive may still contain lots of church weddings all over the Chicago area. Capone was so comfortable operating in the church, he ordered 2 murders on the church steps of Chicago's biggest cathedral, Holy Name, Capone's assassin, Jack Machine Gun McGurn, shot Dion O'Banion and later Jaime Weiss. The bullet holes are still visible at the cathedral entrance. A stronghold of the Chicago mob was the suburb of Cicero. One of the local enforcers was a big guy who later became known as the Gorilla. The Gorilla was Paul Marcinkus. Eventually, Marcinkus became the bodyguard for Pope Paul VI. Despite zero experience in banking, Pope Paul appointed Marcinkus secretary and then chairman of the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank was a mob front. In the 1970s, for example, they held the funds of Michelle Sedona, heavily involved in money laundering of heroin profits from both the Italian and American mobs. When Sedona's personal investment portfolio collapsed, the Vatican Bank reportedly lost some $80 million. The Vatican Bank also set up Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed after discovering about $1.3 billion in missing money. In 1973, the heads of the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section of the U.S. Department of Justice, William Ehrenwald and Bill Lynch, questioned Marcinkus in his Vatican office. Topic: his alleged delivery of $14.5 million in counterfeit bonds to the Vatican 2 years earlier. Italian grand juries wanted to indict Marcinkus, but the Pope demanded Vatican immunity. Eventually, Marcinkus was given a remote church post in Sun City, Arizona, where he died, leaving a $500,000 home and estate. His partner in crime, Robert Calvi, general manager of the bank Ambrosiana, was not so lucky. He lost the mob's money, and in 1982, the mob rubbed him out. The day after he was fired, Calvi's body was found hanging from the scaffolding beneath a bridge in London. He had 5 bricks in his pockets. Calvi's secretary jumped or was pushed to her death out of a 5-story window. Chief suspect in these deaths was fascist gangster Licio Gelli, who ran the secretive Italian Black Friars, a terrorist society known as P2. Gelli lost a lot of money when Bank Ambrosiana collapsed. He was arrested but then escaped and ultimately died peaceably in his home in Italy. At all times, the Chicago mob had a direct link to Pope Paul through their Cicero gangland stooge, Marcinkus the Gorilla. Oh, and did I mention that when Hitler came to power, Pope Pius XI wasted no time and on July 20, 1933, sealed a concordat with the Hitler regime to stay quiet during all Nazi activity. Article 16 binds all Catholic bishops to swear allegiance to the German Reich before assuming their church office and to not interfere with Reich policies. That's why the church said nothing when the camps were set up, when the Nuremberg laws were decreed, when Kristallnacht burned through the synagogues of Germany, and even during the war itself, which killed millions. And this Reich Concordat was never annulled. It's still in force. And let's remember that Hitler would have never gotten his early powers enacted on March 23rd, 1933, the so-called law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich, and that Hitler's cabinet was empowered to enact laws without parliament or the president, had the Catholic center parties, the Zentrum Party, not given all of their 11% of votes to elevate Hitler to dictator. The Zentrum Party was led by Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, who reported directly to the Vatican. The church was comfortable with fascists. In 1929, the church cut a similar deal with Benito Mussolini, who preceded the Fuhrer, plus a substantial relationship with Generalissimo Franco in fascist Spain. History also recalls that the Catholic Church was part and parcel of the most sadistic killing regime in the Holocaust in Croatia, where they joined with the Ustashi, which heinously murdered tens of thousands of innocent Jews and Serb Orthodox. The Ustashi gathered baskets of eyeballs. The unspeakable atrocities committed by the Ustashi are too blood-curdling to detail here, but they operated a concentration camp called Jasenovac, which was a magnitude more hellish than Auschwitz. It is thought that 80,000 Jews, Serbs, and others were murdered by the Ustashi in rituals too ghastly to describe. Franciscan monks carried out mass executions in the 3 villages near Banja Luka, where about 2,000 Serbs were slaughtered using gruesome physical methods. The Jasenovac camp, by the way, was overseen by Franciscan monk Miroslav Filipovic, who personally and brutally oversaw the murder of some 30,000 individuals, often tortured by horrid methods, and about 100 by his own hand. He wore his priestly garments while murdering. In 1946, Filipovic was tried for war crimes and hung. Although Filipovic was suspended and then expelled from his order, he nonetheless wore his Franciscan habit at the gallows. A truth commission after the war concluded that some hundreds of Catholic priests and monks were involved in the genocide. During this entire genocide, Pope Pius XII granted provisional recognition to the Ustashi and monitored their every activity via church contacts. Chief Ustashi Ante Pavlovich mainly worked through Cardinal Aloysius Stepanich, appointed by the church as the main contact. After the war, Chief Ustashi Pavlovich was given shelter in the Vatican and protected at various papal residences. He was smuggled into Italy and then to Argentina via the extensive church rat lines, which relocated Nazi war criminals to other countries where they could hide. In 2018, the Ustashi monsters were honored in a special Catholic Mass in Zagreb and another in Bleiburg. The World Jewish Congress wrote to Rome and the church and begged them to cancel it. Their pleas were ignored. I didn't have time to get to the Inquisition, so I offer this advice to a fellow Chicagoan, Pope Leo. You might think twice about declaring on behalf of God that my father's prayers and the prayers of the IDF won't be heard. You might look closer to home. Now to my preliminary topic, that is the war in Iran itself. During this ceasefire, the Iranians are furiously deploying heavy diggers to clear the entrances of vast missile cities. Some of these missile cities are 10 and 20 kilometers large under the ground. They are preparing to resume fighting. We are watching, of course, every move from outer space and preparing to resume our military kinetics. This includes the complete devastation of Iranian power plants. I have learned that a new weapon may be used to wipe out these electrical stations. It's called CHAMP. CHAMP stands for Counter Electronics High-Powered Microwave Advanced Missile Project. It's a missile with no explosives, but instead works like a microwave oven, but 1 million times stronger than the one in your kitchen. It permanently fries every wire, circuit, and computer chip within its range. No bomb, no explosive. Thus, even if little girls are standing around a power station, that won't protect it. There are nearly 500 power stations and key substations in Iran. We don't have that many CHAMP installed on missiles. My best guess is we currently have several dozen, but CHAMP is being readied right now, and there are 2 other directed energy weapons which are also being readied. Another key action by CENTCOM just before the ceasefire was the destruction of 6 railroad trestles and bridges, which makes it impossible for Iran to resupply, since most of that resupply occurs via train. But Iran is a construction wizard and is now already busy rebuilding those 6 trestles. However, CENTCOM's focus this moment is on the economically suffocating blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That is just those ships passing to or from Iranian ports. Here to tell us more is former CIA staffer and current Iran watcher, Clare Lopez. Clare, how effective is this blockade, and can it finish the Iranian regime?
Well, thank you very much, Edwin. And I will begin by talking about Pope Leo, as you introduced there, perhaps not paying much attention to just war theory, according to which the United States Operation Epic Fury and the Israeli one, Roaring Lions, has been in complete accordance. I will leave it to our legal experts to expound more on just war theory and international law. What we have talked about since the beginning of these operations and the beginning of March until now has been a kinetic phase of these operations. This was called U.S. Operation Economic Fury. The most recent events that have taken place were in Pakistan this past weekend when American and Iranian envoys met in talks there. The talks went on in a 21-hour marathon. J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff were the United States envoys, but I think perhaps it was a learning experience, and that's why J.D. Vance was assigned there. Perhaps he did learn something about the Iranian negotiation tactics. They failed in the end because of the sticking points. The Iranians refused to give up their nuclear weapons program and also demanded the inclusion of a ceasefire by Israel taking action against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which, by the way, not part of the ceasefire agreement, which will end this coming Tuesday, the 22nd of April, if not extended. And so with those things in the background, where are we now? We are now finishing the kinetic part of this operation that the United States objectives were to take out Iran's nuclear weapons program, its missile program, its naval and air forces, ground forces as well, commanders and leadership of the command and control for these armed and security forces within Iran. And where we are now is a kind of a jujitsu move by the Trump administration, I would call it, and that is the blockade, as Edwin mentioned, of those ships and vessels going to or from only Iranian ports. In other words, the others of the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, Bahrain, Emirates of Saudi Arabia, they may pass and are passing back and forth through the Strait of Hormuz. But the blockade is a jujitsu move on the Iranian original intent to close that Strait of Hormuz and to demand toll payments, millions of dollars, from ships that they did allow through. That's now ended. The United States is in control of the Strait of Hormuz on both sides, the Persian Gulf side, and on the other side, the Gulf of Oman. And so we are deploying now minesweepers to sweep up whatever mines there may be under the waters of the Persian Gulf on the Iranian side of that Strait of Hormuz. And also what is happening because of the blockade that we have instituted, selective blockade, I should call it, is the intent now for an economic Operation Epic Fury. And that is to induce the financial collapse of whatever remains of this Iranian regime, which will happen within weeks, if not sooner. Something like 90% of all of Iran's annual trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That amounts to around $110 billion, that is annually. Comes to perhaps around $435 million a day. That is cut. Almost all of Iran's seaborne trade is now cut off. The cascade effect from that cutoff affects their entire financial system, which, as I said, can be expected to collapse within weeks, if not sooner. The other part of that is important to note is that Iran's oil storage capacity, which is something like 60% full right now, has a capacity for around 55 million barrels total. That will fill very quickly, and they are going to have to stop oil production and cap their wells because they won't have any place to put the oil. That's a very serious setback for their financial and petrochemical industry. I don't have any time to talk about the effects on China or the effects on the United States and the benefits that we're gaining from this, but maybe in the back and forth we can, or the Q&A. I will talk about what is now in charge of whatever's left of the Iranian regime, and that is the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Pasdaran. I will name these as Mohammed Bakr Ghalibaf, who is the head of the Majlis, the parliament of Iran. I will name Mohammad Bakr Zolgadar. He took the place of Ali Larijani, went off to meet his virgins, and Zolgadar is now in charge of the National Security Council of Iran. Ahmed Vahidi is the commander of the IRGC, and Mohsen Ejei still remains. He is the head of the judiciary system in Iran. And the fifth person I'll name is the law enforcement commander, Ahmed Reza Radan. We have no idea if Mojtaba, the son of the former supreme leader, lives or is barely clinging to life. He is in no condition to exert any kind of power whatsoever. By the way, neither is the existing president, Masoud Pezeshkian, out of the picture. Those that I just named are Twelvers. These are the Shiite followers of the 12th Imam. These are the most devout, faithful, and practicing of all Muslims on the face of the earth. But they follow the 12th Imam, and the objective of these remainders of the Twelvers is literally to instigate Armageddon on earth, because they think that that's going to bring back the 12th Imam, usher in the Day of Judgment and the end times. By the way, quickly, neither Mojtaba nor his father Ali Khamenei was ever an Ayatollah. We've got to stop calling them the Ayatollahs. They're not. Neither was ever advanced theologically ever beyond the middling clerical rank of Hojatul Islam. Then finally, what I'll say is that inside of Iran right now, they've long prepared for this kind of an eventuality, which is the breakdown of the command and control system at the top levels. And so therefore they have something called a mosaic model, and that is a decentralized model of operation that extends across all 31 provinces of Iran. And that's what they're operating on now. Without communication to their former command and control, they are operating only the IRGC, the National Police, the local law enforcement, and Basij forces, operating on orders previously given, but they cannot receive or get or ask for any updated communication because there is none. It's been taken out. The final thing I'll say here is that within Iran are many ethnic groups. I will name the Baluchis, the Azeris, the Turkmen, the Kurds, the Ahwaz Arabs. They have been and continue to be armed, have been for a long time. They are in open armed revolt against the center. So is the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the opposition resistance forces, again with a presence across all 31 provinces, not just in any one ethnic area or another. They too are armed and in open revolt against the center. Let me stop there. I think my 3 minutes are up.
That was a very long 3 minutes, but very valuable. I just want to make a couple of comments. You transposed the two aspects of our war. Our kinetic war is epic fury, and the economic fury, which has just been opened up by the Secretary of the Treasury, has identified funds all over the world, and those funds are now being frozen. You brought up an interesting point. Since they can't export their oil, as soon as those tanks get filled, Iran has got a problem. And the problem is when you pump oil, you can only do three things with it. You can transport it, you can store it, or you can use it. Otherwise, it spills on the ground. And you are right. They're going to have to cap all of their oil wells, and they're going to be in complete disarray. And now to our main topic. The Iran war, is it legal? All you hear from critics is that the war is somehow illegal or a war crime, especially because dual-use militarized civilian infrastructure is being targeted. These claims are false and intended for audiences who don't understand international law, what it is and what it is not. The people who study international law know that there is no actual law in international law that is not using law in the way ordinary people use that word, that which would be a legislated code that governs behavior of all parties. In fact, the term international law is better called international agreements, between specific countries to adhere to specific behaviors. And if they don't, such as Russia invading Ukraine, there's not a lot that can be done about it because there's no body that can enforce international law. And if there was, it would be the Security Council, which can be vetoed by one of the P5, and those P5 include Russia, China, or the US. So it's mainly a talking point as well as a guidance for all nations, and it's a fabulous confusion tactic for the uninformed. Once two or more countries agree in diplomatic convention, that agreement is said to become international law, even though it only impacts the countries who signed and ratified. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway Convention of 1903 was originally just a construction contract, but it was elevated to an international convention when the Ottoman Empire and the Baghdad government elevated it to a diplomatic agreement. The father of international law is often considered to be Hugo Grotius, who in 1625 wrote on the Law of War and Peace, which established a code among warring nations. This included a concept of imminent danger, which he defined as, I'm quoting, immediate certain threat to life or property where action must be taken as the danger cannot otherwise be avoided. That's imminence. Hence, a nation may act, including via preemption in the event of imminence. But the concept of true imminence has changed over the centuries. Now with nuclear weapons, imminence can mean a genuine threat coupled with a genuine capability. In the nuclear age, we cannot wait until we see the mushroom cloud. Moreover, no one is going to the United Nations to ask permission under Chapter 7 or Article 51 or any other section when decisions must be taken on the basis of national interest and immediacy. During the Cold War, NATO had a first strike nuclear doctrine it was prepared to deploy at Fulda Gap, Germany, where the West feared an invasion of 1,000 or more Russian tanks. They called this nuclear option the speed bump. It was actually small tactical nuclear weapons, especially the M388 nuclear projectile, which was to be launched by the Davy Crockett nuclear system. Germany is now unified, but our leaders were kept up at night during the Cold War, fearing any minute a nuclear conflict would start at Fulda Gap. Today, we have a nuclear doctrine that can launch mass devastation nuclear missiles from ground, air, and sea on the basis of a 20-minute threat analysis of unknown incoming objects. We have all seen the movies. We call those scenarios DEFCON 5 down to immediate action, which is DEFCON 1. Based on hypersonic missiles, those decisions will be made in mere minutes. The UN will not be consulted. In fact, the major wars have never been international decisions. America joined World War I because President Wilson didn't like the wording of a German telegram, the famous Zimmerman telegram. We joined World War II because we were forced into it, Pearl Harbor, and we didn't check with anyone first. The war in Iran that is now being waged is not illegal because Congress did not need to declare it. Congress has only declared war 5 times and never since World War II. That means the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Gulf War, Gulf II, the 6-month war over Libya, the war against ISIS, our 51-day bombing spree against the Houthis, and scores of other military actions has no congressional declaration. The framers first wrote, Congress can, quote, make war, but they realized that was a mistake. They wanted only the commander-in-chief to have the right to make war. So James Madison, framer of the Constitution, sponsored the change to Congress can declare war, close quote. Thus, the president can make war, Congress can declare war, which is a higher level of conflict. There has been a lot of discussion around President Trump's threat to bomb bridges and power plants in Iran, and the airwaves are filled with Democratic and legacy media claims that this amounts to a war crime. Totally false. First, to bridges. Bridges in a modern society with a mobile military serve a distinct, undeniable, and indispensable military purpose. All bridges are dual use. Under international law and under America's law of war, once a military dimension or advantage accrues to a bridge, a hospital, a school, or other structure, that structure ceases protection under civilian status and becomes a legitimate target. The U.S. and its allies have aggressively destroyed bridges in most of the wars fought in the past 150 years. In World War I, the U.S. destroyed bridges over the Marne and elsewhere in Europe. In World War II, we destroyed all 26 bridges and railroad trestles over the Seine River and many more. In the Korean conflict, we bombed thousands of bridges, big and small, over and over again. In Vietnam, we repeatedly targeted the Paul Doumer Bridge and the Tan Hoi Bridge. In the Obama-led campaign against ISIS in 2016 and 2017, the U.S. bombed all 5 Tigris River bridges near Mosul, Iraq, and in Syria, all key Raqqa bridges across the Euphrates River. Between 2015 and 2019, some 130 bridges in Yemen were destroyed by a Saudi-led coalition heavily supported by American munitions and logistical support. War moves on bridges. War means destroying bridges. We make movies about destroying bridges. The bridge over the River Kwai, the bridge at Remagen, the bridge over Toko Ri. Now, what does the U.S. military manual have to say about it? On page 251 and thereabouts, the legal authority states, and I'm quoting, similarly, the possibility that bridges or tunnels would be used to assist in the adversary's military operations in the future could result in such objects providing an effective contribution to the enemy's military action, even though they are not being used at that moment for such purposes. Close quote. Quote, this contribution need not be direct or proximate. Despite this historical and legal clarity, plenty of experts on TV or in press releases will try to create the delusion of illegality. Now to power plants. In World War II, Allied forces, including the USA, targeted electrical infrastructure as part of the strategic bombing campaign to destroy the Axis industrial capacity. Britain launched Operation Outward, sending 90,000 weaponized balloons toward power grids to destroy scores of German power stations. In the Korean War, we bombed electrical power systems regularly to disrupt production. In the 1991 Gulf War, America continuously bombed Iraq electrical generation, destroying more than 90% of the country's power grid. In the 2003 Iraq War, we did likewise. A recent Pentagon study stated, quote, electrical power has been considered a critical target in every war since World War II and will likely be nominated in the future, close quote. The War Manual states in section 5.6.8.5, titled Examples of Military Objectives, Economic Objects Associated with Military Operations, close quote. It reads, economic objects associated with military operations or with war supporting or war sustaining industries have been regarded as military objectives. Electric power stations are generally recognized to be of sufficient importance to a state's capacity to meet its wartime needs of communication, transport, and industry, so as usually to qualify as military objectives during armed conflicts, close quote. And ladies and gentlemen, the case law that I've studied supports this completely. Destroying bridges and power stations are customary, legal, and necessary in our fight with this crazy theocracy in Iran. Don't believe the false analysts. Prevailing in Iran means that the decent majority of that society can rebuild and again join the community of nations. The first Geneva Convention was signed in 1864 and created the Red Cross. After the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's Lieber Code of Protection for Civilians became widely accepted across the planet. It was appended by the Hague Regulations of 1899 and 1907, which were spearheaded by one of the greatest mass murderers in history, Tsar Nicholas. After World War II, all Geneva Conventions were updated and the Fourth Geneva Convention was properly promulgated. But the point is, Good law can be perverted by bad people acting in bad faith. We have seen that in our country, where justice was turned on its head to enforce racial discrimination or cover up for power. The point is this: international law is a catchphrase that can be weaponized by those on either side of an issue. That said, America and Israel have abided by the theories of international law because they are both societies that cherish the concept of legal war, even if the legality is enforced only on our side. Now, I left out 99% of the story, but I have two experts on international law who will say much more. The first is Yifa Segal. Take the mic, Yifa, and tell us if Israel and America are following international law to the extent that international law actually exists.
Well, hi, Edwin. How are you? Good to see you. Thanks for having me. Look, I mean, for me, it's a bit of a comical issue, unfortunately. I mean, I have to tell you, I love international law. I wish it was actually a thing. I wish the nations of the world wouldn't abide by it. I wish people would honestly judge the actions of Israel and the United States according to international law. Unfortunately, that's not at all the case. Many people seem to have like a Pavlovian reaction. Whenever they hear Israel, they immediately go out and say it's whatever we do is illegal. I mean, even if we save puppies in Gaza, it's illegal. Everything is illegal. So, look, I mean, it depends on what angle you want me to elaborate on. But generally speaking, there is a nation, the regime in Iran, for almost 50 years have been actively working towards the annihilation of the big Satan and the small Satan. We have been in active war against Iran for 2.5 years at the very minimum. You know, their rhetoric, their actions, their proxies. There was even a clock, I believe we bombed it in Tehran. There was like a countdown to the annihilation of Israel. So if you try to understand, international law was created, it was created by nations who actually meant to advance the values that we today live by. Human rights, you know, to stop advance peace across the world, to protect civilians if there's conflict. They didn't think that there would never be conflicts. They just thought that if everyone abide by these rules, then, you know, targeting civilians just to target civilians should be illegal. And I think we can all agree with that. So at the end of the day, we have to understand that there is actual, not just intention in terms of rhetoric by the Iranian regime, but also actual action to try to promote that agenda and destroy the state of Israel. They've killed thousands of Israelis and Americans over the years. So in terms of the intention of international law was to prevent nations from starting wars, to take resources or destroy and annihilate enemies, and to give tools to other nations to act in self-defense if there is another nation or another group that is actually intending on destroying them. So if you judge the intent and if you judge the actions of what has been going on, as I said, for nearly 50 years, and particularly the last 2.5 years, then there's no other way of looking at it than actual literal self-defense of Israel and also the United States by launching, it's not launching this war, it's by launching another round, a more intense round of fighting against Iran. People misjudge the situation when they said Israel and America launched the war a month and a half ago. We didn't launch the war. It's another round of more intense fighting to respond to a war that was already launched by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I want to say something about intent, because a lot of these, you know, so-called interpreters of international law kind of lost track of what is, you know, a fundamental rule of our societies of what it means to have a just solution to what can be a very tragic situation. So I'll give you a brief example. If I tell you a story that a child was hit by a car and he was killed by that incident, and I would ask you, what is justice? What can be just in dealing with the situation? Then if you are an honest interpreter of the situation, you would have to ask, what are the circumstances? You know, it's very different if it was an accident, if the driver had a heart attack and swirled off the road, if it was someone who intentionally went out and targeted the kid, if this was a terrorist act. There are a lot of different circumstances, and intention is something that is extremely, extremely significant. So, for example, when people look at the war in Gaza, for example, and they say, you know, 50, 60,000 Gazans have been killed. Yes, it's very, very tragic, but they forget to ask what are the intentions, what happened there, what are the circumstances, and it's not enough to look at the results. So yes, the United States and Israel have definitely, thank God, the upper hand in the military campaign in Iran. It's not enough to assume who is the just party and who's not the just party. If you want to ask anything specific, I'll be happy to answer, but that's just my general overview of the situation.
Well, I would ask you this. How do you answer people who repeat this lie that Israel's committing genocide? What do you say to, I know what I say because I've studied genocide for many years. What do you say to them, knowing the points of genocide and what Israel is doing for self-defense?
I've been saying this at least since the war after October 7th started in Gaza and then Lebanon, now Iran. If we're trying to commit genocide, then we are really, really bad at it. I mean, you can see the Iranians, by the way. I think it's very, very powerful images coming out of Iran where Iranians are sitting on their balconies on rooftops and American and Israeli missile strikes the building next door. And they feel very safe because they know that they're not a military target. So they can sit there and film it and even cheer for it and be very, very happy and then upload it to the web, knowing perfectly well that our weapons are targeting specifically and very, very precisely military targets. So you see these images coming out of Iran and it tells a broader story. So obviously the numbers don't show genocide. If we have all this firepower and we keep on firing outside of the areas where civilians are and are hitting mainly in very impressive numbers military personnel and military targets, then I don't see even how you can make an argument to support genocide. Genocide, by the way, I just want to add another sentence. It's exactly founded on this issue of intent that I was trying to talk about earlier. You have to have an intent to commit genocide. It's not enough to show that X amount of people were killed. You have to prove intent. And obviously, as I said, all evidence point out that this is the exact opposite of the Israeli and American intention in this war.
Yes, as Avi Bell would tell us, genocide requires two factors, the intent and the action to advance the intent. Yifa, stick around. We've got some questions. Right now, I want to go to one of the world's most informed and thoughtful experts on international law. I give you my friend, Professor Avi Bell in Israel. Take the screen, Avi.
Thank you very much, Edwin, for having me, and thank you to my co-panelists. Before I address your specific question, I want to go back for a second to the remarks that you made about Pope Leo and the little bit of discussion that there was. I feel compelled to say things not only because one of my employers happens to be a Catholic university, but more generally, there's no doubting that the Catholic Church has a disturbing anti-Semitic past that stretches back centuries, more than a millennium. That said, Vatican II significantly, fundamentally rewired things. Pope Leo is fairly new to the scene. And aside from committing the unforgivable sin of being a White Sox fan, I think it's a little bit early to judge where he's going to end up on all of these issues. For Catholics, he is the vicar of Christ on earth. I think we have to be cautious in the way that we speak about him. His remarks on the war, I think, are shallow, but that just reflects the facts that he was speaking more political cliche than thoughtful analysis. And I would just tread cautiously before reaching too far and judging Pope Leo on this. I suspect, or maybe I'm hopeful because I'm optimistic, that he is actually somebody to whom it is possible eventually to speak. Now, setting that aside, okay, so I think you raised two different kinds of international law questions, and I want to address them very, very briefly. Yifa, I think, did a very fine job. And then I want to talk about why it is we need to talk about this. And I think that's really where the most important issue is. So there's two kinds of criticisms that are being made of the United States and of Israel in the current phase of the war, or the current campaign. And one is that Israel, the United States, acted wrongly in opening up airstrikes and in opening this campaign about a month ago. And second is that in conducting it, that Israel, the United States, have violated the law in this way or that. And it's important to understand these are two distinct questions legally. That is, they have nothing to do with one another. However you get into a war, there are certain rules that govern your conduct of it. And they don't change, so that if Israel and the United States were wrong in the beginning of the campaign, that doesn't tell us anything about whether they're conducting strikes properly. If they are conducting strikes improperly, that doesn't tell us anything about the justice in going to war. Now, I think that Yifa is right when we think about the questions of going to war. The way this is discussed is generally off the mark. Iran has been in a war against Israel for a long time. I would argue it's been in conflict with the United States as well for a long time. Whether the conflict against the United States reaches the level of war is a different question. Like when Iran more or less dispatched somebody to try to assassinate Salman Rushdie in New York, in upstate New York, was that an act of war? So we can argue about it. But since the United States and Israel are operating in concert here, the United States is an ally of Israel. Israel is already in a war with Iran. Even if you have a pause in the war, that doesn't mean the war is over. Edwin, you're an historian. Think about the phony war, right? When the Nazis paused after swallowing up their half of Poland before taking on the Low Countries and France, it was commonly understood that didn't mean the war had ended in any step that France were to take. If France were to have the courage then to have struck at Germany, one would have to be a fool to think that would be France beginning a war. That would be France taking steps to defend itself within an ongoing war, and it would have been nice that they would have had the courage and the ability to do so. In this case, there is and there has been an ongoing war, even if there are pauses in it. It's fairly clear that Israel and the United States can strike within that war at times that which they're most likely to be successful. I'll add that even if one thinks that somehow or another the wars previously ended and a new war, an entirely new war started a month ago, there are two perfectly plausible justifications under international law for the United States and for Israel to have acted. One of them is the idea of humanitarian intervention. This is something that's been invoked in other cases. In fact, has been demanded in other cases. The UN Charter says that in Article 2.4 that one may not use force except consistent with the purposes of the United Nations. This is interpreted by many people, I, by the way, happen not to be one of them, but by many people as authorizing states to use force to prevent mass human rights violations of the kind that Iran was engaging in and continues to engage in, such as slaughtering its own people for engaging in political expression. And one can quite plausibly argue there's no way to stop the Iranian regime from continuing these mass human rights violations without the use of military force. And if it weren't the United States and Iran, but it were, let's say, several years ago, France and Rwanda, people would be cheering instead of claiming it's an international law violation. Now, the last plausible argument here, and it's the one that's perhaps been most discussed, is that it's possible to invoke a recognized right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, even prior to an armed attack, if the attack is expected and imminent. There's this debate among scholars what counts as imminent. And here I have to say that's been the longstanding position of the State of Israel. I think it's correct that imminence is not judged by how many seconds it is until the onslaught of the enemy. It's more a question of when is the window in which you can be effective in preventing the tragedy. And this doesn't arise much because states tend not to argue this way. This is for academics to argue this way. It's not for states to argue this way. But it seems to me a perfectly reasonable argument that you do not have to wait until the knife is at your throat to act. You act within the window of opportunity to prevent the murderer from getting at you. That is part of what the United States has been expressing, what Secretary Rubio is expressing about looking at the threats from Iran. There's a question of what's the window in which we can effectively do something about them, and when does that window close and we will no longer be able to do something about it. So I think that it's fairly clear that Israel and the United States are great cases for having initiated conflict, because I don't think they initiated conflict at all. They were initiating a particular phase of it. And then there's another question about how Israel and the United States conducted themselves within this. And within this, they've conducted themselves according to Hoyle, that Israel and the United States are both very, very careful about running targeting issues through a legal review and ensuring that they target only targets that can be lawfully targeted. Now, I have to say here, like apropos our conversation about the shallowness of the comments that Pope Leo made, there is a very rich Catholic tradition about thinking about both these issues, about when one goes to war and what sorts of things one can target. The modern laws of war are based on the writings of a Catholic theologian, Thomas Aquinas, and they're fairly clear that one may target objects that contribute to the military capacity of the enemy, even if they're ordinarily thought of as civilians, such as power plants and bridges and tunnels and communication structure, and et cetera. And one may do so so long as the expected collateral harm to civilians is not expected to be clearly excessive. And it's hard to see how it's going to be clearly excessive. I should add that in this case, because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard controls so much of the Iranian economy, striking their facilities purely because of their economic capacity makes that it would be lawful targeting. So if you're striking at a bank in Iran that is controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, that is a legitimate target. Right? You don't have to show that they're taking the cash out of the vaults and using it to shoot. Now, having said all that, I now want to convince you, like this, like in the minute that I've got, just to tell you that we're thinking about this all wrong if we think that anybody cares or should care about this. I like all this stuff. I'm an academic. I think about these issues all the time, and I like considering the subtleties of the laws of war. But none of the critics care about it. Right? International law these days in the world is not a code of conduct for states. It may be phrased that way, but in reality, it's a pile of rhetorical stuff, of information and cliches and doctrines and false claims that are used in political argumentation. Now, that doesn't mean that we should go and say we are disobeying international law, because there's no reason to do so. At the same time, we should never make the mistake of thinking that by abiding by international law or by explaining that we are abiding by international law, that we're achieving anything, because our critics don't care about that. They don't care about international law. What they care about is going after the United States, going after Israel, advancing their political aims through the rhetoric of international law. And the only reason to talk about international law is to help the few people left in this world who actually care about international law, to understand that by being silent, by not speaking out against the critics of the United States and Israel in this campaign and others, by allowing international law to be reduced to just a pile of rhetorical, political talking points, right? By allowing its substance to be perverted in this way, they are destroying international law. Right? They are, not we, they. And if they don't wake up and open their mouths and save their institutions from the corruption that they fall into, and don't silence these, and don't respond to these critics who are perverting the law, then there will be nothing left for them. There will be no international law left. And so it's time for them to wake up and do something if they think that international law is important.
Well, all I can say is that I found your remarks, especially the latter part of your remarks, to be most valuable, most instructive, and most penetrating. And I should also say that I spoke to Professor Bell, Avi Bell, before this show, and his thoughts have guided my thoughts along the same lines. He's very, very right, and Yifa is right. We're looking at this on two levels. One is reality, and the other is it doesn't matter. And both dimensions count. Fabulous presentation, Avi Bell. Let me get to a couple of quick questions here. We're over, but we're going to go. Rita wants to know, she's in Century City, where I hope to be soon. What will it look like when the regime collapses? How will the opposition groups react? Okay, I'm going to answer that. And that is, the regime has collapsed. But in the same way that Germany collapsed after World War I, Japan collapsed after it signed the surrender. But the last Japanese soldier to surrender was in 1974. And 12 years after Germany was devastated, Hitler rose to start the whole thing again. And people, including people I know, say, well, now the regime is worse. There's crazier people. It's true that when you take off the top layers, the residuum is often crazier, more fanatical. But what we're trying to do is to destroy the apparatuses which can be used. And we're doing this economically. We're doing this with kinetic bombing. We're doing this with potentially stopping their electrical systems from working. So even though they exist, they won't be able to exert the power that they hope that they would. So really, we can't judge the regime by the loudmouths and the slogans that we're hearing. We have to judge it by their ability to wage war, and that ability is getting skinnier and skinnier. Doesn't mean that a guy with a bazooka can't step up on the mountain and take a shot at a tanker. But the point is, we need to look at the degradation of the regime to judge that regime.
Can I make a comment, Edwin, on this issue? I fear I don't fully agree with you on this point. And I have to tell you, there's something that I've learned about the jihadists for a very long time. And the thing is that for them, they don't judge victory or loss by our standards at all. For them, if they're left standing, they won. And we see this now with Hamas, and we've seen this with Hezbollah, and all these different rounds. And I think what Israel has learned after October 7th is that if you just kick the can down the road, then your kids will inherit a much greater problem and a bigger conflict, and we can't allow this regime to stand, because as far as they see it through their theological, radical Islamist point of view, is that Allah has helped them to bring the entire world to its knees, to win, to even survive against the greatest army in the world, which is the United States, together with Israel. So if they're left standing, even if all the damage and all the degradation of the military capabilities and all the death and everything that we have, conflicted on them, if they're left standing at the end of this, then we're dealing with a much stronger ideology, greater spirit, believing that Allah is with them and they're right and righteous, and will just leave a much greater, bigger conflict. It will take them years to go back to their capabilities of harming us. But that, again, it means that we're leaving our children with a much bigger problem.
I don't think there's any disagreement. I think we both agree. As long as they're standing, they consider that they've won. What I was speaking about was their ability to translate this sick philosophy of theirs into actions. And that requires electricity, money, weaponry, machinery. 30 seconds, Claire.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that as the regime collapses, and it is collapsing, what I think is very important to emphasize is that somehow the country of Iran, despite its many ethnic minorities, must somehow be held together and not allow all of these Baluchis, Azeris, Turkmen, Kurds, Ahwaz Arabs to spin off into pure chaos. And that must happen by an orderly change of regime that will hold the country together. You know that I support the National Council of Resistance of Iran in this, and oversee a period of perhaps 6 months or so, during which a new constitution would be written, and also a new Majlis Parliament, or the preparations for election to a new one, would be set. That is the key part of as this country collapses. It's got to be held together somehow. Maybe the nationalities have a federated or autonomous, region kind of an arrangement whereby they are allowed to, for example, teach children in the schools in their own language, but that they owe their allegiance, just like in America, we have states with legislatures and governors, but we send each of our states a representative to the U.S. Congress Central, something like that for the many provinces and ethnic groups in Iran.
I think your point is well taken. And so what I'm focusing on is the depletion of their ability to act out their insanity. But I would also like to say, apropos Yifa, I would also like to say my own point of view, which I believe is part of the new conceptia that occurred after October 7th. I am no longer interested in coexisting with those who wish to kill us. I think that from now on, the preemption is you want to kill us, you have the means to kill us, you're taking steps to kill us, that's enough for us. And now I turn it over to Avi with another question here. Can our legal experts please address the issue of anticipatory self-defense? Avi.
So I think I spoke about this briefly, but I'll say something a little bit at greater length. So the old rules of war before the UN Charter were fairly simple, that you could engage in anticipatory self-defense. You could go to war for any just reason, right? They called these things by the Latin name, like casus belli, right? Any casus belli would justify war. You declared war and then you went to war, and it could be because you feared an imminent attack, could be for a variety of other different reasons. Now, the rules of going to war changed with the UN Charter, but the UN Charter did not purport to change the rules of self-defense, right? The UN Charter acknowledges in Article 51 the inherent right of self-defense of all states, which is going back to the already existing rules of self-defense. So the already existing rules of self-defense are that states have the right, in fear of imminent attack, to defend themselves. And the international law experts, so-called, love to argue about this. But the reality is that states, after the UN Charter, still do not wait until the knife is at their throat. They act when they can to defend themselves. And that is what makes modern international law. That is what makes all international law, is what states do and the legal reasoning they give behind their actions. It's right. It's called customary law, and it is state practice plus what they call opinio juris. And it's fairly clear that states still do view themselves as authorized by law to engage in preemptive or anticipatory self-defense. So it's a lawful thing under the UN Charter. It is done all the time. It's not particularly relevant to this case because Israel and the United States were not starting a war. They're carrying on a war that was already going on.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, these are all sage comments. I'm so happy we've had the time, but now we're out of time. So I want you to hold for my closing word of wisdom, just 2 minutes away. But first, I need to thank my brilliant guests, Clare Lopez, Yifa Segal, and Avi Bell, all friends. Plus, I thank my talented international team, including Rebecca in the Philippines, Eve in New Jersey, Lance, Michigan, Wes in San Francisco, Holly in Nashville, and many others in numerous additional cities around the world. I'll see everyone back here in 2 weeks at 3 p.m. You want to be a friend of the Edwin Black Show? Go to theedwinblackshow.com/support. Keep me independent. You want to hear me in person? Consult my events page at edwinblack.com. Until then, head over to any Barnes & Noble in the USA or any Amazon, Walmart, iTunes, Google Books, Kobo, or Audible.com platform in 190 countries across this roiling, toiling, boiling planet, where you can find any of my 325 book editions, such as IBM and the Holocaust, and my latest volume, Israel Strikes Iran. You want an autographed copy? Hit edwinblack.com and click books. Get access to participate in live future shows at theedwinblackshow.com. But remember, you'll see a much enhanced and exquisitely produced version of this show and prior episodes by subscribing to our YouTube channel at The Edwin Black Show and click the notification button like tens of thousands of others have. Follow me at Edwin Black Book on X as well as Facebook. And now for my closing word of wisdom. The world is like weather. It is constantly changing. I'm zooming out from our nation's capital. Bless all of you and pray for all that is unfolding before our very eyes.